that everybody in the state.
All right. One second. So it's a pleasure to welcome today Ray Siemens. I guess I met Ray for the first time the same place that I met Elizabeth, right? 2013 and 2012 in Leipzig. And Ray has been someone that I've been talking to a lot and has been to some extent, along with Elizabeth, really, an inspiration and a model for what we've actually just done this particular week that we're in the middle of. And I really am happy that you're here and happy that we have an opportunity to collaborate and to pass on so many of those great things that you're doing at your home institution to this pretty cool community here. So Ray Siemens is the Canada Research Chair in Humanities Computing, right? And he has the interesting job of being a professor with a joint appointment in English and computer science, right? Which is probably not happened a lot in the world. I don't know if it does. Ray is really, right in the center of what's happening in North American and global digital humanities. And so we're really lucky that he's here with us today and that he's behind the scenes and he's watching and he's talking to everyone and opening all these doors for us here. Really, really lucky. So I really don't want to go through the long CV. You can see the kinds of things that he's done on the people page of our website. He does run a lab, a digital textual cultures lab, electronic textual cultures lab at the University of Victoria. And he also runs the Digital Humanities Summer Institute, which is like this one, of a week duration in Victoria, British Columbia, every summer. And it's gone from being a one-week affair with a ton of courses to being a 3-week affair where you can go and do sets of courses. And I'm sure that he'd be happy to talk about that with anyone here who's interested in kind of making, after what they've learned here, jumping off and taking another step and entering a community which has been doing this kind of digital practice and research for a long time now. So Ray is going to be talking about something that I actually just stepped into a little tiny bit myself a couple of weeks ago when I was in Phoenix and talking about implementing new knowledge environments. INKE, is that how you pronounce it? INKE. And it's 2.0. I don't think I have 2.0s on the title of the thing on the website. Great. From theory to application, installed and publishing via large-scale teach partnerships. Welcome, Ray.
Thanks. Thanks for the opportunity to be here and share the pleasure of your first of what I hope are many successful institutes with many wonderful people, all contributing, learning, teaching, talking, occasionally eating and drinking coffee, and more than coffee. If you ask me, it's what it's all about. And it's a real pleasure and an honor to be here. Plus the fact that it's so beautiful, that doesn't hurt either. I apologize for the title. It's a very weird one. It's not sexy or catchy. In fact, if I were to see this title, it would be a complete turnoff for me. So I'm doubly grateful that you came. The title exists for reasons that I'll talk about in my talk. And my talk, basically, is going to be what I hope is a nice complement to the 2 talks that have already happened at the end of the day, the first couple days of the Institute. The first day we heard from our external colleagues with NSA connections, talking about the nature of surveillance. And the subtext for that talk was technology. At times it came right up to the surface, and at times it went back under. People from our digital humanities community, computing community, are being invited into that world to be part of the group that sifts through that information that relates to all of us. And they probably get paid better than professors in the area, I'm sure. And Elizabeth's talk yesterday about multilinguality, multiculturalism, and the development of schools of pedagogy and practice around that. Again, a very wonderful thing. I'm going to do something a bit different, though, and I hope positively complementary. I want to walk you through a project. It's a very big project. I'll tell you more about it in a second. It's called the Implementing New Knowledge Environments Project. And if you are active listeners like I am, I apologized to Nashville the other day. I said, "Are you sure you want to sit by me? Because no matter who's talking, I'm always typing." And she said, "No, that's okay." But not everyone's like that. I want to let you know I'm not offended if you do that sort of thing. And if you are going to type and do whatever, take a look at the webpage. You can click through to some of the programs we have. You can click through, take a peek at some of the publications. You can explore who's doing what, when, and where. We're a pretty active group. So please feel free. I'm going to talk about implementing New Knowledge Environments Project, or INKE, I'll refer to it. And what it is, it's a collaborative group of researchers, organizations, and research partners of various kinds, who together explore, via digital humanities techniques, things like scholarly communication, and ways in which reading, writing, and other practices have changed in relation not only to the technologies that are new and emerging at the moment, but in relation to the past history of communication through these technologies, in relation to the way the digital humanities as a very open, integrated interdiscipline can provide a lens on aspects of the way people communicate and have communicated over time. I'll give you an example of what that can mean. Number one, we kind of see this project as being a digital humanities intervention into a number of fields. Some extra academic professional fields, like what we now call the scholarly publishing industry. Others, very, very much academic histories, like the Histoire de Livre, or book history, which is becoming increasingly more allied with fields like communication, which were a generation ago only very new fields. Book history, much longer fields like that. We imagined on the one hand we're an intervention into them. On the other hand, we were imagining points of intersection where we could realign some academic thinking and thinking beyond academia. Give you an example of that. Our book history focus group at my own institution, which is a very, very active group, 40 or 50 people, including members of the general public and academics and graduate students and undergraduate students, all come together for this. We meet in our special collections. Started talking to them, talking about themselves as not the book history group, but the pre-digital book club. They think of things now, continuity from the earliest writing forms all the way up to the digital, but they situate themselves pre-digitally in a period of time that not only has, I think, the value of reflection back to a very, very rich history of communication engagement, but they position themselves deliberately before the switch to digital. And at our Summer Institute at University of Victoria, the Digital Humanities Summer Institute, they run a course in our special collections where they take a whole bunch of computationally savvy people, ask them to close their computers, and they open rare books and work on them. And then they talk about books within the framework afforded us by computation, by digital texts, and so on. A really interesting type of intervention. It's an international team, primarily based in Canada, which is where the source of our funding comes from. And we're just wrapping up the 7-year project cycle. Why I'm talking about this particular project here is not only because it's full of people I love and care for, great people doing interesting things, not only because I think we've made some valuable contributions, which I'd like to tell you about, but because it began at one of our earliest digital humanities summer institutes. If you, again, are an active listener, take a look at dhsi.org and take a look at what we do. We're in our 15th year this year. We've been doing it for a little while with the help of our friends, many who are in this room too. And after the second or third year of running DHSI, which began in the first year with about 35 people, the next year about 50, after that 75, and we're going to be over 700 this year. After the first couple of years, we noticed there were a group of people who kept coming back. A group of people who were really interested in taking the tools, techniques, and so on that we were teaching each other and ourselves, and starting to apply them to their fields of inquiry. We had groups from, well, book history, I talked a bit about that. We had groups from human-computer interface. We had groups from computational modeling. We had groups from data modeling within the computational modeling group. We had groups who understood the history of reading from a variety of perspectives, including a very strong cluster in education as a faculty. I don't know if education exists as a faculty or separate field.
It's a department here.
Department.
It used to be faculty.
Okay. So we had a very strong group of people there who were not only interested in the digital aspects of it, but were very interested in the open access movement. They were a group from the Public Knowledge Project. I don't know if anyone uses open journal systems. This is a group that was there too. We were sitting around, a group about the size of this, the group that's now here, and we asked ourselves, what can we do with what interests us and the skills that we're teaching and learning from each other. We decided we could point ourselves in a specific direction, which is now the INKE project. And we felt that digital humanities, because it represents a very positive, loose intersection. Here's my definition of digital humanities, which is really quick and completely unsatisfactorily vague. It's the intersection of what's always happened in the humanities, which is attention to the material remains of human experience over time, and the intersection of computational method. Those two things coming together. Very vague, but we felt that there was something really important at that intersection for us. We felt that we were engaging that at the Digital Humanities Summer Institute, and we felt that we could move forward. Our early concerns fell into roughly these categories here on this slide. Understanding the book, the scholarly journal, the monograph, scholarly editions as knowledge environments. Understanding them less in terms of their history, although history is very important, more in terms of their future. Our computational our colleagues with computational expertise helped us considerably in that regard. We wish to address issues from a book and a text perspective of ebooks and e-textuality, to establish vocabularies, to talk about electronic books. A number of years ago, we didn't really have a vocabulary for them. There was no Amazon ebook then. There was no Sony ebook reader. There was no Kindle. There was no iPhone. There was no iPad. Can anyone remember that far back?
Yes.
This is the environment we had. It was terribly impoverished. We were very interested in the history of reading and text, and very interested in computational prototyping, which our computer science colleagues understood very well, and those who were computational in science areas, applied science areas in particular. But those in the humanities, the social sciences, education, and our library, all strong partners in our research community, were just becoming familiar with those ideas. Prototyping and saying, what's that? Shouldn't you write an article? Maybe a book. No, we're going to build something. This seemed like a fun thing to do. So, going way back now to the early 2000s, the early decade of this new millennium, that's what we were imagining we could do with the things that we were teaching each other and learning from each other. And we set about then on a plan. We had the benefit of Lynn's project planning and management course. She told us to form ourselves in an organized fashion. Isn't that right? Mm-hmm. And it was a very good moment. Lynn encouraging us. Now, some of you know Lynn and I are married. So this is, okay, we have the same surname, but we got mistaken for brother and sister at the airport. Really sweet. Because if the kids were with us, they wouldn't have made that suggestion. But anyways, because we're husband and wife in a Canadian academic setting, there's always concern with conflict of interest. I don't know if you have those concerns in Germany or Beirut or places there. And so we deliberately did what some academic couples do. Is, if we're in the same room for a talk, we sit in opposite corners. We try not to vote the same at meetings. We try not to have our work intersect. And Lynn and I had both built up rapport with our colleagues, of course, and also with our funding agency. And at one point, we had someone who was advising us on our intersection points as a research team with the institution, with the funding agency, and beyond. And that person then went on to do other things. And so I asked our funding agency, I said, so what do you think we should do? Who should we get involved? And one of the vice presidents of the funding agency said, I think you're married to someone who has these skills. And I took that as an opportunity to work more closely together on this particular project. So just before 2004, we began our very loose team formation at DHSI. And then we as a group talked to Lynn basically formally with the blessing of our funding agency and said, can you help us understand how we can take this very loose collection of ideas and aptitudes and interests and energy and focus it? Lynn said, well, take a look at some of the research programs, gave us a list, and then suggested how we could come to address that. In 2004, we got funding to be HCI book, Human Computer Interface and the Electronic Book. We even came up with a really cool logo. You like that? The planet above the open book leaves. That didn't last. But we had a great time together. We had a whole series of consultations. We were funded with I think, somewhere around $30,000 or $40,000. And that enabled us to expand our group and formalize our group. We went from a small group of like the number in this room to about triple the size. And we had several meetings, several different places in North America at that time. We didn't have a lot of funding. We could only stay close to home or near close to home. And we figured we'd talk with people representing 90 or so disciplines and subdisciplinary groups to try to understand what we could do within the framework of our new knowledge environment conception. Most notable, and Lynn or someone had referenced it already at our time together, we tried to define as a group what a book was from those 90 disciplinary and subdisciplinary perspectives. And by the middle of the second day trying to define that, we decided we simply couldn't, and what we should do is rather list, acknowledge, and enumerate, and so on, the different views we have of the book, and try to work with those different views. And that was the end of our trying to define, at least the book and what we were doing. Those discussions weren't fruitless, though. Those discussions were really positive and added value in the way I think especially humanists add value to problems. You look at a problem, you ask yourself questions about the questions you're asking for the problem. And in fact, you build up layers and layers of value-added interpretation and engagement on a single object. Let's say like a revisitation of the book. The book wasn't a problem for us that needed to be solved. Rather, the book was an object for contemplation, interpretation, and varied engagement. We then moved on the next year to another facilitation grant called Implementing the New Knowledge Machine, Human-Computer Interaction in the Electronic Book. And we engaged in another year of consultations and began to imagine, again, pre-iPhone, pre-iPad, pre-any tablet of any kind, even the Microsoft Zoom, I think. Does anyone know the Microsoft Zoom? I like to reference obscure technology. It was the music player that never took off, but billions of dollars were invested in it. At any rate, Microsoft product. Well, that was still semi-current. We were starting to articulate the course of action I want to tell you about. We began then formalizing conversations with our funding agency who worked with us, worked with Lynn, worked with a number of our research team towards what's called a Strategic Research Cluster Development Grant, and then ultimately what's called a Major Collaborative Research Initiative Grant. None of them are sexy titles. The title for my talk is not sexy. Things will get even less sexy as I keep going, I promise. How's that for incentive? And so with this, our funding agency gave us the equivalent of what in the tech world, some of my CS colleagues who work very much in the very active tech world, the commercial technology world, gave us basically startup funds. They gave us 2.5 million Canadian dollars spread over 7 years. Those are Canadian dollars, not American dollars, so it's probably about 2 million of that, and then in any other currency, probably much, much less. And we worked with our partners too, using that as startup funds to build out. And ultimately, between our institutions, our research partners and beyond, we had another $10.4 million in contributions. And that gave us, in essence, resources to work together for 7 years to explore the problems that we were intent on articulating and engaging. Sometimes in a humanities audience, it's important to talk about why you need money to do things. Well, we wanted to do things beyond what our typical humanities colleagues were doing. I talked with my chair about this, talked with my dean about this, talked with our librarian about this, talked with my VP research about this, who rewarded me by putting me on a committee, computing research infrastructure. You've had that talk. And we had to make the case. Humanists typically, it was felt, did not need money because they had the lab of the humanities to work in. They had the library. That's where your books were. If a book wasn't there, you could go to another library or get interlibrary loan. But we were humanists who wanted to work with supercomputing, ideally, to help crunch some of our texts and analyses. We were humanists who wanted to work with electronic book platforms, which were at this point in our development, just when we got the funding, just beginning to emerge. The iPhone had not yet come out in Canada. Canada was a year and a half behind the rest of the world, but we still had our iTouch. Canada got the iPhone after Rwanda because of internal regulatory issues. But we needed money for things like this because they were the objects of our study. We needed money to facilitate the computation. Plus, we had a very large research team coming together. And so I'm talking in very big numbers, I think, in humanities context. But once you split that between the roughly 35 to 40 core researchers who've been involved in the project over 7 years, there are 4 to 5 graduate students each. So add that, 4 to 5 times 35. The 20 to 25 postdocs years who have been employed as part of the project. And Matt Hebert is one of those who's been working with us on many things. Thank you, Matt, for being on the project. Correct me if I say anything wrong. We in essence, when you take a look at that sort of funding and you break it down, you think people need computers, because in those days the humanities departments didn't buy computers for their professors, even for research. It starts looking like a lot less. Ultimately, though, that's less important than talking, I think, about actual research questions. Here's how we articulated them back in 2007 for 2008. How does the internet change the way we read? We wondered. We knew that it did. We didn't know how. And interestingly enough, in the passage of years since 2007, 2008, we still know it does, but we don't know exactly how. But we're starting to zero in on it. How do we interact with information in new digital spaces? We all know digital interaction changes the way people think and communicate. What's the best example of that? You may have noticed sometimes you're talking with a colleague who's particularly digital, and that colleague's pocket vibrates, and in the middle of their conversation they pull out a phone, you're thinking, oh, how rude, that must not be so engaging. And they're just reading the text that's come. That changes the way we interact, doesn't it? It changes the way we engage. That's information coming in new ways. We asked what new features can improve online environments. We had the pleasure of working with a group of colleagues based at University College of London at that time. We're looking at usability in academic resources, particularly those coming out of the United Kingdom and France and Germany at the time. It was called the LIRA project. And they were very interested in studying existing environments to the positive end of making those environments more accessible, more navigable, and more engaging. We were working with them. We also asked ourselves, as a group of humanists that were fairly large in number, how do we work together to research our objectives? This has been an ongoing, very positive engagement over time. We have a lot of people doing a lot of different things. One of the tasks that we've had at hand is to understand how best to work together as humanists, not as people in industry, not as administrators, not as those in governmental offices, but as humanists. How can we work together with maximum efficacy? This has been part of our research all along. Our initial objectives then, answering those questions or responding to and following from those questions, were as follows. We were trying to document features of previous textual forms. We were trying to advance our understanding of the impact of the digital on reading. We're trying to conceptualize new knowledge environments and develop tools to create dynamic and functional reading interfaces and prototypes of them. Not just a plan or an idea manifested in article form, which would be an intersection or an intervention into a theoretical engagement of some kind, but actually build stuff. And try to build stuff in an environment where the sand was constantly shifting and reshaping under our feet. We were asked one year why we tended to choose small projects, very bite-sized projects, not multi-year engagements building tools over many years, but rather projects that could be knocked off in 6 months to a year. Because it was felt that if we didn't do things that were large and substantial, we wouldn't be making positive research contributions. And our response to that was, well, if you're in an environment that's changing so rapidly around types of reading, and again, the examples I keep using, various types of mobile phones, the smartphones, iPads, or tablets, or smaller and smaller laptop computers. If you're working in that sort of environment where the hardware is changing all the time, R&D is just screaming like crazy along in the private sector, you can't really count on anything being around for more than 6 months to a year. So we basically adopted research, our R&D cycles from industry in terms of the timing of our own research intervention, always looking for specific moments to build something and then quickly move on and either iterate it into something else or build it beyond. That was a very difficult thing to justify to ourselves and then to talk about to others. We were people who wrote articles and books when we began this project. We also wanted to ensure process documentation and planning to facilitate all our work together, and this comes from trying to understand what it is as a group of humanists, to work with the team beyond those in the humanities, to intersect with appropriate administrative and other sorts of environments, and ultimately ensure our work got done. We began with a plan, roughly, to work as follows, and we followed it pretty much throughout. Our first year was largely foundational. We figured out how to work together, we figured out how to gather our equipment, we figured out how to talk with those in high-performance computing, our infrastructure providers. Turns out they were wonderful people. We just hadn't met them yet. But it took us a while as humanists mostly to figure out how to talk with them to good end. The first year beyond that foundational year was a year that we focused on corpora, largely getting textual and extra-textual corpora together, building the data banks and databases of materials that would then become our focus in the future. Working in years 3 to 4 on scholarly editions, years 5 and 6 on scholarly journals and monographs. And year 7, the one we're just entering, our numbers are a little bit off, but are on the slide, looking at sustainability, consolidation, and then disseminating our research, integrating further with our partner organizations and moving forward. We operated not as a body of the whole or as individuals running wildly in all directions, but we tended to organize in teams that had specific focus points. In our first couple of years, we had 4 teams focusing in non-mutually exclusive ways on interface design as a key core issue, information management as a key core issue, textual studies, and particularly its history, is a key core issue, and user experience, also sometimes called reader studies, as a key core issue. After a number of years of pushing with our groups in that direction, we reformed. In essence, we took our information management group and we ensured that each of the other teams had someone, as we say, up at the coalface doing the hard work who also had information management experience. And so we restructured to have those teams and our textual studies expertise moving in the same direction there, adding a new team beyond interface design and textual studies. That was our modeling and prototyping team. And then for the last several years, we've been working simply with the interface design, modeling, and prototyping teams, engaging our work in that way. And I promise I will talk about our work in a moment today. So today, as we enter year 7, we have these 2 teams, interface design, modeling, and prototyping. And we're looking at issues of sustainability of our research, moving forward with what we've done, consolidating it, passing it on to our partners for further development. The folks most active in INKE today, the names will be familiar to some, myself as director, Stan Rucker, who's at the Illinois Institute of Technology, School of Design, also called the New Bauhaus, where the Bauhaus leaders left during and after the Second World War. Stan's working in interface design, and John Bath and John Siklowski are working on modeling and prototyping. This year we're working with 11 other researchers beyond this group, 19 graduate research assistants, 1 postdoc, 2 programmers, a fairly big administrative team, and a number of other affiliated researchers and organizations. Our current concerns represent a movement from those that I talked about before. I put some retro devices up on the slides, I hope you don't mind. Some are earlier than others. We're currently now concerned less with intervention into textual studies and human communication over time, but more concerned now with praxis. We're more concerned with applying what we know to the environments our partners inhabit. So that extra academic scholarly publication unit, for example. Along the way, we've spun off some tools. So we're interested in intersecting with scholarly communication and production. We're interested in understanding further online reading and writing environments. One of the interesting things that's happened over the past 7 years since we first articulated our research is the way in which it's not just, let's say, passive sport, passive activity that reading is online. Reading always seems to involve some sort of feedback, even if you're just pushing buttons to move the page. Typically we're not, though. Typically we're clicking on things to get more information. We're sending information out, we're annotating and commenting in that way. We're very interested in how reading and writing environments are starting to merge together. Interested in sustainability and dissemination, and particularly what our partners are doing. Here's how that changes our research questions. We ask ourselves, first of all, how can we reimagine scholarly communication as open social scholarship, where reading and writing are activities that come together and where communities that have knowledge and expertise work together across a range of knowledge and expertise. We're asking ourselves how electronic journals and monographs evolve beyond traditional forms, maybe even beyond recognizable forms based on tradition, into forms that people seem to want to engage more readily. We ask ourselves, how can we make meaningful contributions to the development and future online, of current and online interactive environments of many kinds. We do this, again, with our current team from Interface Design. There's a sense of the wonderful people involved here across most of North America and some of Northern Europe. Interface Design has been working particularly on a bunch of projects you may have heard the names of, and if you click through to our homepage, you can go and explore them in more detail. I'll talk about a few key ones in a moment. This group likes to give some interesting names to project. Bubble Lines is my favorite name. Sightlens, Dial-R, Table of Contexts, Paper Drill, Multi-Touch Variorum, and so on. What we've been doing over time is building these tools, putting them out there, allowing people to pick up on our code base and do what they will with those tools, talking about them at conference and so on. If you want to learn more, you can just go through our website and see a full write-up on each of them. Our modeling and prototyping group, a very, very active group. One consultative researcher, our postdoc Matt Hebert, right there. Lynn and I also have the pleasure of working with them. Modeling and prototyping has been working not only on some of the development and interface-oriented issues of the other team, but specifically focusing on proof of concept, taking intellectual ideas and manifesting them in computational prototypical form. These have evolved into tools that have spun off in really interesting ways that I'll talk about now when I tell you a bit about the sorts of things that we've been up to. One of my favorite interventions, among many favorite interventions in this group, it's really hard to pick, but I like this one because of its title and the way in which it remembers ideas. Dynamic Table of Contexts, which in a very simple way takes a traditional book's table of contents and an index and puts them together. Very simple idea, very difficult to pull together in a way that real humans will use. But that's what this is. There's your reading material on the right. There's your table of contents on the other side. There's your index. It will, if you poke and prod this prototype, you can do simply by clicking through on our site. If you poke and prod the prototype for this, you will find that it will actually rearrange elements of your reading patterns of a linear written book based on your interests. Pretty nice. Sort of thing you can only really do online. You can't do in any real, I think, interactive way without the online environment. Another, new radio. A browsing environment which rather than operating in lineal form operates in circular radial form. Taking images, texts, whatever you happen to want as objects to be preserved, curated, and engaged. Throws them in and gives you a whole series of different interactive formats and interactive methods of engaging. Lead researcher for that is John Sokolowski. One that a few of you know about, Matt was kind enough to mention in his discussion the other day during the lightning talk, a social edition of the Devonshire manuscript, where we asked ourselves, in terms of the scholarly edition, a very staid, traditional, stoic, authoritative form. We asked ourselves, what happens when you take that and you put it up on Wikipedia? What do people do with it? It turns out they add value. Who knew? At any rate, social edition of the Devonshire manuscript, and from that project we postulated a theory of open social editing. Very happy to have done so. And thinking about the way in which textual forms previous textual forms were documented and engaged, we worked on this project, led by Alan Gailey, Richard Cunningham, and others, including Brett Nelson and Paul Werstein, the famous Shakespeare editor, on something called Archbook or Archbook, Architectures of the Book, where the community writes, community with solid expertise in the area, writes mini articles on features of books and book culture, so that we can understand them fully with the idea that we can then prototype them more fully. So for example, if you go in there, you will find an entire article simply on the way in which pages are numbered and counted over time. At least I'm sure that's through peer review. I haven't been in there for a while yet, but a brilliant thing. Doing what humanists do best, which is to take, I think, a particular object of study and add layers of value by visiting and revisiting. Building it up so that if someone needs to come in and understand something about the way in which page numbering and page referencing, locational referencing in traditional text has worked over time, you can come in and do that. One-stop shop. Bubble Lines operates in the same way, comparing topical references that are word-based across text, a text or texts. Here we're looking at Shakespeare in the example there. The various words and colors are keyed up on the upper left side. King, thy, lord, thee, and thou. And you can see conceptually how they resonate through the plays in terms of distribution. I don't know to what end you would use that in a scholarly argument at the moment. But I do know that word frequency and word distribution are great ways to understand the content of text, and this allows you to navigate a larger textual corpora in a new way, primarily visual, building on traditional concordances and other sorts of things. Along the way, we've also tried to write a few books and articles. We've also put together annotated bibliographies in areas that have been underexplored. Something that Matt and I worked on recently under Lisa Arbuckle's lead were 3 annotated bibliographies on what we're calling social knowledge creation. When you go into Wikipedia and you make some changes to an article there that improve it, hopefully improve it. I always hope I'm improving when I go in. When you go in there, you're participating in social knowledge creation. But there are very few articles out there theorizing, conceptualizing what that means. There are lots of articles out there telling you how to do it. There are lots of articles out there telling you how it's a positive intervention or a negative intervention in the way in which knowledge is created and curated. But there are very, very few resources that talk about the act itself more broadly. What we hope to do is to situate that with that bibliography. It's a book-length one, led by Lisa Arbuckle. We had the opportunity of contributing to the Cambridge Companion to the history of the book. John Bath and Scott Schofield, one of our postdocs. John Bath was a postdoc as well, who's now an area lead for us. We contributed an article on the digital book. The ultimate chapter, as we like to say, or at least the final chapter in that particular work, digital being the last of the forms that's discussed chronologically in there. Alan Gailey and Stan Rucker, with others on the team, wrote a great article simply telling our colleagues in the humanities how a prototype argues. And so now when one of our colleagues comes up for promotion or tenure or sometimes even hiring, and someone looks at their CV and says, hey, you haven't got enough articles, but you've got these 4 electronic tools, what does that mean? He can then bring this, or she can bring this article out from Stan and Alan and say, here's how a prototype argues. This is why it was important to spend the 4 months I could have written an article with doing this sort of development. And that's how a lot of those discussions go in the communities I spend time in. We wrote a piece on modeling the scholarly edition in electronic form. We wrote another piece on human-computer interface and interaction in the book, where we took those, day and a half of deliberations on what a book is, and we broke that down and talked about the various ways one could understand the book, like function, form, and so on. And in essence, created what was a fantastically problematic discussion into an article which documents the many facets of the book and book culture. As well, members of our interface design team published a piece on information visualization for humanities scholars in particular. Just a sample of the sorts of things we published. We also tended to bring INKE, which came out of our Digital Humanities Summer Institute community, we brought it back in. And now we find DHSI is not only a place where people come as those wanting to engage the sorts of tools, techniques, and approaches we use in INKE, and out of which originally INKE came, but we find we're teaching courses on INKE's technologies and contextual technologies at DHSI, and in the future we're going to be working together more. Plus, we've also had the chance to organize, as part of our funding agency's mandate for outreach and engagement and inreach, a number of various types of meetings and points of exchange with communities elsewhere. Our first meeting was at the University of Victoria, but we've taken the show on the road to The Hague, to Kyoto, to Havana, to New York, to Vancouver, Whistler, to Chicago, Sydney, Australia, and beyond. We're trying to fill a number of places on the map. We're getting closer. We'll see how it goes. We'll see how it goes. Those are our gatherings, and so thankfully we have funding for these partner gatherings that's encouraged for us to bring what our funding agency calls generally, for all those doing work in our area, the best of Canada to the best of the world. And it's been great. So we got together, we joined a conference in The Hague, another conference in Kyoto. Even in Havana, we found a community of people like us who are doing the sorts of things that bring us together. Get together for a few days and talk about what's important to us. So, what's next for us? Well, we're moving forward. I've probably got about 10 minutes left in my talk, David, if that fits okay with our timelines. So, as we move into our next phase, we're at year 7 of 7. We're going to sign on for another 7 years if our funding agency and our partner group is interested in joining us, and all signs are that they are. Our objectives for those coming 7 years are roughly, we want to develop and implement creative strategies for engaging, cultivating, disseminating knowledge and data beyond those that we've done. We want to work with our partner groups in particular to move in this direction. We want to enrich and extend teaching, learning, and research through alternative modes of inquiry, those which are much more specifically digital and focused, and building on the traditional foundations that we all know and love, but ask ourselves very real questions about what's next, and try to put our money, if you will, where our mouth is, or try to enact the sorts of things that we're finding and engage them in a positive way. What we want to do also as part of that process is bring together what are sometimes in our community discourse called siloed environments, where you've got a great bit of work happening over here, and a great bit of work happening over here, but because of the way, say, the fields are organized, or the departments of inquiry and so on are organized, the disciplines are organized, they never talk to each other. We want to get more of these groups talking together. One of the best things about working in our Implementing New Knowledge Environments extended team structure is that it's not always the same wonderful English people or the same wonderful computer science people that I have the pleasure of working with at University of Victoria and beyond. We also work with people, like I say, from roughly 90 different disciplines or subdisciplinary groups. So we always have new ideas. We're always explaining to each other the things that, say, our discipline might understand and take for granted. Almost take for granted. And yet we notice when we have to explain it to someone who's never encountered it before, we ask ourselves questions about what's important about what we're doing, what's important about how we convey it. We question ourselves, the nature of what it is we do, and we ask how it can be better. Particularly when we start pointing these things, I think, at digital resources and beyond, the questions become very engaging. We want to integrate and share projects that are useful to more than one constituency, and we want to do so in multiple contexts. That can mean working multilingually in some cases. It can mean working in terms of multicultural contexts and others. Particularly, our interface design people are most sensitive and most acute to this, and those who are focusing more on data development think less of it. But we've got a great team, and we're poised to address this. Our concerns largely seem to be situated, moved from traditional academic types of concerns in the digital age. They're now moving to humanities-based digital scholarship and electronic publishing concerns. Those are the areas we're working into in our funders' thinking and our community's thinking. Academic prototyping and what's now being called critical making. Is that a phrase that people are familiar with here? No. Sometimes 3D printing is called critical making. You have an idea of what you might want to build, you design it with software, and then you hit print. And the object that you have created, you printed, is made from the conceptual idea you had. I think artists are much more comfortable with this than, well, again, where I came from, writing books and articles and so on. But critical making also means something much beyond. It's a suggestion of a process that if you, let's say, have a concept or an idea, it could be, say, a theoretical engagement or an engagement into, I'll say theoretical engagement for the moment. You can give it life not only by trying to prototype it computationally, but perhaps even imagine what you build in the physical world beyond that. Critical making, very, very cool and engaging area, to my mind. Training and advocacy, we're treating in a much more formal way. Elizabeth talked zeroed in on this in wonderful ways yesterday, so I won't go into any of that background. But we realized we were taking for granted the fact that we came from an interdisciplinary community like this one. We completely took it for granted. We didn't think about it for years. We didn't understand how unique that was to the nature of our own thinking and our own work. And at some point, someone pointed out to us, you couldn't have done that if you hadn't talked to the book history people, and if you hadn't had computer scientists in the room, and if your library wasn't full. And we thought, wow, again, we took it all for granted. We were just a group of people who got together like this, liked each other, and wanted to do something. Open access has been a game changer for us too, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. Our organizational structure has also changed a little bit too. We've got large community to work with. We think a lot about how we organize and interrelate. We're going to go from what we call 2 research teams or groups to 4 clusters, which we've now visualized as you see there. We're going then from our modeling and prototyping interface design teams to clusters that focus on interface and modeling, which is an extension of what we're already doing, but specifically also extend that into areas of integration and engagement. So a new cluster for us is engagement. It's led by Brian Owen, formerly acting librarian and now associate university librarian at Simon Fraser University. I'm also the developmental lead of the Stanford-based Public Knowledge Project. Brian's task in this engagement cluster is to focus on the necessity of strong partnerships. Not partnerships where one person acts as a service unit or one group acts as a service unit for another, but rather partnerships which are mutually beneficial, where groups come together because of the things that they can do with the other group, or many groups coming together because of things they can do larger than they could do by themselves alone. Strong partnerships, absolutely essential for the sort of work we're doing in our national context, the Canadian national context. We have a way of talking about that. We talk about it now as scholarly digital infrastructure. And so many of our partners come specifically from that particular unit. Our engagement cluster also focuses on diversity across those groups, ensuring that we not only, that we have different approaches, different materials, and different focal points across the board reflected in the work that we're doing, across shared projects, across shared areas of interest. And of course, the pooling of knowledge and results that comes when you work with others. So in addition to this engagement team, we also, as our cluster, I'm getting used to the new vocabulary, our new cluster, we also have the integration cluster, and that's going to be led by Lynn, and is being led by Lynn as we move forward. It's largely a liaison group for coordination and community building. Lynn, correct me if I say anything wrong here. Working in concert with other clusters and with our engagement group. In essence, to translate prototypes, I don't mean translate from one language to another, but explain, apologize for, bring prototypes into integrated projects to help us do what's sometimes called crossing the valley of death, which sounds horribly grim. Software developers working in the commercial world call this by that phrase, which is when you have a really great idea manifest in a prototype, but you try to put it into production for a commercial client, let's say, or say you're in the library, you've got some really interesting feature for reading journal articles and this corpus you've got this great person who's done and conceptualized your ideas in a prototype, now you want to make it so everyone can use it. Apparently the gap between the idea of the prototype and having a functional production model is the valley of death. Yeah. Maybe I'll stop talking about that. You need some translation there. You need some people doing that work. And it's not work that at least many of our team have typically thought about in those terms. We're just very grateful we're working with Lynn and others in that regard. We're also interested in focusing in our emphasis on training, on sustainability, on disseminating ideas, not only in ways that we feel comfortable talking about those ideas, but in ways that other communities can actually understand what we're saying. Which could mean taking an academic article and republishing it in a completely different way for a general populace. Less specialized terms, that sort of thing. Discussion, engagement, and so on. Our research questions here become, what's the best way for active researchers to work with partners and organizations and others to contribute? In this case, again, Canadian focus, Canadian digital infrastructure. We have a great partner, well, among many great partners, but for this particular point, a great partner in a group that's called the Canadian Research Knowledge Network. Now, they've been described as, in very base terms, as a buying club. What they do is they purchase all scholarly digital information across all disciplines for the entire nation of Canada. And so we kind of think of it like a bulk store. If you buy in bulk, you get a better deal, right? So the idea is if you buy your information in bulk, you get a better deal. And what that means is everyone in Canada has access to that information. And it all sits in this small building in Ottawa. It's our nation's capital, and then it's disseminated from there. Well, our Canadian Research Knowledge Network, CRKN, asked themselves, what would happen if we were able to start layering tools over that? All the information that we bought, not just little bits in here in English and history and sociology and medical sciences and so on, but all of them. They're one of our best partners for this sort of thing. What they're doing is working on an integrated digital scholarly environment called IDSE, IDSE. See, that's pretty catchy. That'd make a good title for a talk, unlike the one I chose. They're working on IDSE. And in working on INSEE, what they become is our partners working with massively large data of professional information providers like ourselves. We need to know how to work with them. We need to know how to work with their data. They need to know how to work with the scholars they serve and the research and development technologies, communities that they address. So we're all in it together. We ask ourselves also, how can we ensure in-process electronic publishing platforms reflect interdisciplinary concerns? Great example of this is the Public Knowledge Project. We've been partnered with them in various ways for over a decade now. Has anyone used an open journal system, published journal, OJS?
Yeah.
There's a really cool thing about any of the OJS platforms. None of them are based on new technology. They won't use new versions of any of the platforms they develop on. They won't integrate graphics extensively. They deliberately stay backward compatible beyond what the typical, say, Eurocentric North American development communities will, because their biggest group of users exist outside of those, let's say, privileged technological communities. This is something that we need to think about, definitely, and I think probably humanities scholars might not be the best place, but the Public Knowledge Project, our partner in this, is. They're thinking about what the world's needs are, not just what Canada's needs are, or what those who have money for high-end computing infrastructure's needs are, as well as what's going on across disciplines. We ask ourselves also, how do we build on the 7-year past we have together, building tools, understanding how to work together, integrate with communities, and recognize that we're shifting academic focus. Our upcoming concerns around humanities-based digital scholarship and electronic publishing, around training and advocacy, around open access, and around academic prototyping and critical making. And when we talk about how we're intersecting with electronic scholarly publishing, we're really interested in fostering digital knowledge production across the board, not necessarily just by experts in subdisciplinary areas. We're interested in experimenting with scholarly applications of tools and methods in the mainstream, but also beyond. We are interested in prioritizing open access and open source, so that not only can everyone who has access to the technology, and hopefully wide technology, get at the things we're doing, but we want them also to get at our code, not just our knowledge products, however they manifest, our books or articles or things beyond that. And we're going to continue creating new platforms, tools, and in some cases, modes of scholarship. 10 years ago, speaking of modes of scholarship, probably no humanist would have thought of including a graph or a visualization, as we now call it, in their article or book publication. And yet, these days, it's hard to open an issue of any journal that I read in my traditional field. I trained in early Tudor non-dramatic poetry. I'm one of 10 or 20 in the world who are interested in that. But any journal I read, I can't open really without seeing some sort of visualization these days, some sort of graphical representation. And it's not all because it's gotten cheaper to print images, I think, and print publication. There are other reasons for that. And we're also interested in re-envisioning elements of peer review, the qualitative assessment process that a lot of academic work undergoes. When one begins thinking of open social scholarship, you begin thinking immediately, well, what that means, what communities are served, what communities are participating. When you have an open community, an open knowledge community, it means it's not just experts who have access to the information that's being conveyed, not just experts who have access to the methods of conveyance. It means everyone's there. Think Wikipedia. Potentially anyone can get in and edit if you have the language skills, the computational facility. We're trying to understand what peer review means in that type of context. We have no answers, but it's a neat problem to think about for the next 7 years or so. In terms of training and advocacy, we want to continue building communities around shared interest and methods. Some people describe the digital humanities as a large community of practice, where shared ways of doing things bring people together, versus, let's say, content areas. I read history, I read literature in English, I read literature in Arabic. Now, those are traditional ways of looking at things. We tend to think more in terms of methods-based communities here, digital humanities generally, but we imagine how INKE as a project can fit into that, focusing on conjoint student and professional training. One of the great things about events like this, one of the great things about the INKE research team, is we have expertise at all, let's say, chronological and hierarchical levels of engagement. Occasionally you'll have someone who's a new master's student on the team, teaching the rest of the team, including the full professor, how to do something. Not everyone's comfortable with that. I think it's amazing. And also working to establish further partner networks, including the DHSI and the extended DH training network. Elizabeth, we haven't talked about this yet, but maybe David, you and I can in the future. We're partnering with academic societies, like the Canadian Society of Digital Humanities, and partnering also with our infrastructure provision groups for things like access to mass data storage and high-performance computing. Compute Canada, it's called, for us. And in terms of open access, well, one of the things that happened Lynn and I were flying here was that our national government adopted a new policy related to open access, one that's been in the works for 15 years. This policy dictates that any work funded by Canadian taxpayer dollars, so all of our national funding agencies and some of those that exist internationally as well, any work funded by those resources has to be open access within a year. Preferably direct open access. That was a compromise. They were going to say direct open access initially. It didn't take. This means that as a country, not only do all Canadians have access to anything that can be bought digitally in terms of the sorts of professional information we would engage, but all Canadians will also, within 1 year of publication, have direct access to all information that we as a nation publish. Following France, following the UK, and where Germany and Italy and Spain sit in this, but I think they're all talking to the same people, so we can't be too far ahead or behind each other. But this has been a real game changer for us. It means that the information we have, the ability of working with, not only has magnified and we can do some interesting things with that, but it has potential, I think, in future, from a DH perspective now, to be more interoperable. We'll be able to do more, we'll be able to look with our tools across fields more readily, and there will be less behind closed doors. So our priority to open source and open access development is something now that's shared by our funding agency, and in fact all those who are funded by it. We're looking to integrate that with more conservative, more traditional types of scholarly production, like a publisher. If you are someone who's in a discipline where books are written, you write your book, you send it off to a publisher, hopefully they will peer review it, give you good news, come back, you'll sign a contract saying, I give you all the rights to my work. You give it to the publisher then says, okay, I will sell your work. That's been funded by the government. That's been funded by your institution, that you have invested time and effort in. I will sell your work. That's one mode of scholarly publication that's changing, if everything has to be open access. Publishers can't get the same sort of return on that. We're very interested in engaging that economic system. And in terms of prototyping and critical making, we really want to be focusing now on projects that less produce the articles and books. I've been slightly berating. I still write articles and books. I have one coming out next year. But we're wanting to collaborate specifically on projects that have tangible results. Idea, perhaps manifestation of the idea in traditional academic form, which could be an article or a book or a conference paper or some type of intervention. But then, ultimately, as one does in praxis, you look for the area of engagement and you build into it. And it could be a critical making sort of engagement, which has a physical end product. It could also be a tool that allows the idea you had in the outset to be manifest, a function, and so on. Here's a list of our partners, affiliates, and associates who joined us just a few weeks ago, just north of Vancouver, to provide input and engagement of the next phase of our work. And it's a growing list. Our initial list of partners 7 or 8 years ago was very small. It was under 20. And in those groups, most of our partners were not what I would call invested research partners. They were wonderful to work with, but it was an experiment for them. They were saying, how can we work with projects, a project that's being led by those in the humanities who are digital with a research team beyond the humanities only. How can we work with them? We've never worked with them before. 7 years later, all our partners are invested. They want to be doing co-development with us. They want to work on areas of engagement beyond development. They're interested in our humanities-based ideas, or computer science-based ideas, or education department or faculty-based ideas. They want to know what that means for them and the changing world that they see in scholarly publication, the changing world that they see in book production, the changing world that they see in professional communication. We have a few events upcoming. This is the second to last slide. One is a Birds of a Feather event, and these are the things that we take on the road and go and visit other communities around the world. 2015, we have one coming up November or December. It's a group of about 35 to 70 of us, depending who shows up and exactly how that works out. Location to be announced, but I think we're going to be meeting outside of Sao Paulo in Brazil, which will be very exciting for us. We have a partner gathering just after next Christmas in January 2016, just north of Vancouver. We have a conference on modeling digital humanities data in the context of INKE coming up in June 2016. And after that, the world lays all before us. You saw the map I showed you. There are many places we haven't been as a group, and we really should. And I hope I can twist David's and your arms to allow us to come back as a group and enjoy the wonderful hospitality, the great engagement, and to be frank, the tremendous intellectual stimulation that this environment has. I think you're blessed, and I'm blessed, and very grateful to be here. Thanks for letting me talk about this project. That means so much to me.
Thank you. Thanks, Ray. That was awesome. I'm sure that Ray would like to answer your questions, respond to your comments.
The expense of asking a stupid question. What happens to production, those who are not into the digital humanities, etc., when everything becomes open access? Why would people who are in it for other reasons want to publish or write? I mean, I don't know if I'm making myself
No,
clear,
I understand. That's a great question. No, but I think that's the question everyone's asking. Okay, so if everything is open, what's in it for anyone who's been involved in the traditional system to do what they're doing? So if a publisher can't recoup the investment they make in terms of their own money, and so why would they be in the game? They can't recoup costs, they can't make a profit. If the intellectual disciplines that are invested in publication won't be able to hold their knowledge close, what do they have to gain from it? I think what's happening is that people are really shifting their focus, shifting the way in which they're engaging tradition around these sorts of things, and focusing in some cases on core principles. So the publisher question, I think, is a really deep one and a very important one. The economic models just can't be sustained with open access publishing, but think of what publishers have always done over time, not in the last 40 or 50 years, and maybe not elsewhere. Think of publishers more like university presses. Does AUB have a university press?
Sure.
What does it do? It publishes things.
Publishes books.
Yeah. Why does it publish those books? Like, why didn't, when they were thinking of having a presser, just say, oh, Oxford will do it, or the Sorbonne will do it? You need something in your local community, right, that understands the work you're doing, understands what's important to you and to the locus that you serve. So one of the ways I think you can view in terms of mandate and manifestation there is to say that even though publishers don't make a profit, we haven't had publishers always that have thought in terms of profit. Why does AUB Press exist? Probably not to make money, probably more for ensuring that work that's valuable done by the community here for the community here is disseminated and distributed, handling the pragmatic aspects of things like qualitative assurance and peer review. Presses do that and have always done that over time. Handling distribution of physical objects, which in the digital age is maybe less important, but still there are distributions that need to be done.
But
The production needs to be done.
that changes, I think, what counts as publishable material as well.
It sure
What we
can.
define as publishable material. I mean, you won't get, for example, bestsellers or other types of writing.
No, that's true. That's true.
What counts as a publication after that?
Yeah, well, academically and extra academically, I think the questions are very different. You know, one of the things our kids, so Lynn and I have two kids, one's 20, one's 16, and maybe that's too much personal information, but it's necessary for what I'm about to tell you. Okay, one of the things our kids do is they go online and read fan fiction. Do you guys know fan fiction?
Yeah.
Okay, so I was willing to watch the Star Wars movie and maybe read one of the books, but would I read fan fiction? Probably not. Most people in my generation would give you a similar type of answer. But for my kids' generation, our kids' generation, they think that's amazing. How does that stuff circulate? Well, You know, nobody has the rights to it except the authors, and they usually give away the rights because they send it out electronically on discussion lists. There's not a lot of peer review, but in fan fiction world, I've looked into it a little bit just so I can seem kind of cool to the kids. In the fan fiction world, when errors are noticed, they tend to let the originator and author know so they can fix the error. And some fan fiction actually goes through qualitative assurance process, much like our scholarly articles do, where others who are maybe not expert in the area that's fiction, but maybe they're expert in the area of writing, maybe they're expert in the area that's being engaged with the writing, they will comment, and maybe then you'll go from the fan fiction distributed via email discussion lists or so on, or people sending to each other on smartphones. You will then go to the next level where it will hit a formal distribution. And I chose the Star Wars example completely at random, but I'm now reminded that it's the fan fiction culture that's actually responsible for the next 3 Star Wars movies coming out. Is that right? I think. Okay, someone's got to be a bigger Star Wars fan than me. I saw the original 8 times. Am I right on that?
I don't know.
No, okay, you're a Star Wars fan.
Star Wars.
But I think, so I don't want to get too much in Star Wars. But, you know, I think really what we have to do is look at why those presses exist in the first place, why those publishers exist in the first place, and ask ourselves, what's most important about what they did originally, and how we can imagine working with them. You know, I think it's great that anyone in this room, for example, could go to the Public Knowledge Project and set up a journal. Now, it may not be the top journal in the field in the first year, or the second year, or the 8th year. But if you have a community of people that's willing to contribute to the journal, to invest their time, be on the editorial board and read each other's work, and ensure that it's of appropriate quality, so says you as a group, you can get that information out there digitally. That's something that we haven't been able to do for ages, and you know what? It really resembles the way our academic society started. If you go and take a look at the early academic publishing, pamphleteers, and letter writing, this is exactly how it happened. Dear Sir, because in those days it was almost always Sir. Dear Sir, I have these ideas about, I was going to say women voting, and I thought, no, that's wrong. I have these ideas about electricity.
And universities were built next to the print machine, like the print factories, yeah?
Yeah.
So that's how it spread.
Exactly.
That's how education spread. But now we're taking it out from there.
And now we're going a bit further out.
Yeah, I have a question. How do you think that camp model is going to affect peer review and publishing in the digital world?
Wow. The that camp model, you mean in terms of, say, pedagogical engagement and
Like-
teaching and training?
Like
or?
we choose to talk in a focus group instead of presenting papers, and we vote for topics, you know, what's happening on Saturday.
Oh, right.
How
No,
is that going to affect the digital community and peer review and open source?
well, you know, in a sense, you have a type of peer review, certainly a sense of qualitative assessment going on in the that camp process. That camps are amazing. I want to apologize in advance. We have to fly home. We have meetings coming up at the beginning of the next work week. So we'll miss that. We've been to many. And the best thing about a that camp is the fact that it's unstructured and energetic. Unstructured in the sense that you don't know until you get there what you're going to be doing, but you have a sense. You have a theme, you have a sense of who's going to be there, what their interests are. And out of that camp, typically what happens, and there are those who in the room who are expert at organizing these more than me, everyone I've been to will basically have either in the virtual world or the physical world, the equivalent of a whiteboard or a chalkboard. And you say to the group, hey, what do you guys want to do? People will say, I want to learn more about interface design. I want to learn more about ebooks or whatever. Then you get all those ideas together, and then you get a sense of how those ideas resonate with the community. Who's willing to teach these things? Who's willing to learn more about these things? Sometimes what happens in that situation is you've got 20 people who want to learn about one specific thing, and so maybe you have 2 or 3 sessions on one specific thing. Sometimes you have only one person who wants to learn about a specific thing, and they're also the only person qualified to teach it. So you have a different sort of discussion. I know when that camp happens here, it'll be much better than that. But specifically in the context of the question, what happens to review? What
I'm
happens to
saying that maybe
publication?
in those
Yeah.
discussions, the best of conversations can come out.
Without a doubt.
But they're not published. How do they get published?
Oh,
Like
lots of...
record the discussion, the panel discussion, and
So many great things have come out of that camps in more, say, fixed form, or more distributable form. So sometimes if people agree at that camps, conversations are distributed. Sometimes there's even someone who will be beaming in by Skype or whatever. So you can have group chats like that. And someone records that as it's going on. Sometimes people sit around and they get a Google Doc going. and they say, you know what, I feel so strongly about this issue, I don't want to tip this on my computer, we're going to write a manifesto, and several manifestos have come out of that case.
Oh, okay.
They do things like David's encouraging us to do. I don't know Arabic, so I haven't contributed to the terminology of DH. I just can't do that. But there's the URL for it, Arabic DH. Those sorts of things come out. Lots of, say, more tangible things come out. But the best thing I think about that camp is the way it inspires.
Yeah.
Inspires us to imagine what we should be doing together.
But is your institute working on changing the way standards should be enforced? Like, because you mentioned something about how peer review should be revised.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yes, we are. We are certainly trying to do it. We have been working nationally and beyond nationally toward policy for open access. And so nothing pleases me more than the success that I mentioned to you earlier, where as we were coming over to Beirut, federal government announced that all projects funded by Canadian federal research funding now has to appear free and open access within a year. So, we've been involved in those sorts of things, but that's very funny academic work. I'll never publish a paper on it, and yet I know I was at all the meetings. None of them were like at that camp. But the idea for that sort of thing emerges from groups of people who come together and talk with each other. And I think there's nothing we can't do if we put our minds together on it. This is going back to Elizabeth's talk yesterday too. It's about a group and a group's inclinations and a group articulating how they feel, talking to each other about their strengths and coming together. Changing peer review, very difficult, I think. Nobody disagrees with the fact that peer review as a qualitative tool is invaluable for us. And pragmatically, none of us will get credit for a publication that hasn't gone through it. But I think in the digital world, there are different types of peer review. There's open peer review, for example, where your reviewers don't hide behind anonymity, where they know who you are and you know who they are. Or as before, it could be single or double blind types of reviews. There are types of publications that have review that's intended to be incrementally helpful to get you to the end when something is quote unquote acceptable according to qualitative standards. Where we're working with MLA on this in MLA's Commons right now
Yeah.
for
I like the fact that you can put a comment,
Yeah.
and so the writer can see your comment, because usually writers publish a paper, and they never see what other readers are saying. But
Exactly.
then another paper might be published attacking what you wrote in your paper.
Yeah.
But why not make it interactive? Like, if someone has a comment, I can revise and change the path of my paper.
Exactly. And so, we've talked beyond the group that I'm here representing right now, which is responsible for that crazy big title. But many in our community have talked with the Modern Language Association about this, talked with its director, Rosemary Field, and its publications manager and much more, Kathleen Fitzpatrick. And they're willing to experiment with us on this, an alternative publication. And that's why that article that's up there, you can comment on.
Yeah,
And the authors will see that comment and go,
and you can
wow.
highlight what
Yeah,
you
they'll
think is
say-
most important.
They'll say, that's a great suggestion, thanks. I'm going to go in and fix that. Or they're going to write you a note saying, how dare you? No, I'm kidding, I'm not going to do that. But this is an alternative type of peer review. Think also what happens sometimes online. I don't know, sometimes people post comments in discussion groups. You can either thumb it up or thumb it down. You get enough positive thumbs up, that's a type of peer review. That's a type of assessment.
In favor of tweet?
Yeah, exactly. Even if it's not an endorsement. Some people have these things that say, just because I retweet doesn't mean I endorse it. And yet people take the time to ensure that their followers, their community sees it. So, these are all types of things worth exploring. And very different from what we traditionally do.
Any other questions?
Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you very much.